Well, we're delighted that all of you could join us here this evening for a conversation about our Christian Declaration on American foreign policy. But the Declaration emerges from Providence, a journal on American foreign policy. Providence is published jointly by my organization, the Institute on Religion and Democracy, by the Philos Project in New York. My organization, the IRD, has been here in DC for 35 years, focusing on analyzing and urging the reform of Christianity's political and social witness. We're an ecumenical organization, and the Philos is a much newer organization, but very dynamic already, working on enhancing good relationships between Christians and Jews, and friendship with the people of Israel, as well as focusing on the plight of persecuted Christians in the Mideast. Providence was unveiled last fall. I believe the latest issue is issue number 4, as I recall, and includes the Christian Declaration on American foreign policy, which is signed by about 40 Christian thinkers in the arena of international affairs. Providence was conceived to address the need ecumenically, but especially focusing on the Protestant and evangelical communities to help crystallize thinking, serious thinking on international affairs, national security, and foreign policy, and to remind Christians about our great traditions going back many centuries on God's vocation for the state and the purposes, the moral purposes of global and domestic statecraft. And so we combine several streams of thought, traditional just war teaching with a dash of Niebuhr and a few other streams as well. The declaration that we're unveiling was conceived to respond to the need, as we conceive it, of a lack of systematic thinking among American Christians about foreign policy. Lots of good intentions across the spectrum, but often the thinking that comes out of Christian circles does not fully appropriate and appreciate Christian tradition about global statecraft, and more often than not, despite good intentions, reflects where people are culturally and politically at a particular place and a political time. So the Declaration, of course, did not claim to speak infallibly or with great authority beyond just the thinking and of those who have signed it and the persons who helped draft it, primarily Paul Miller, who fortunately is here with us this evening. But to introduce your speakers and to moderate will be my colleague, Mark Levecki, who is the managing editor of Providence and is himself a wonderful thinker and scholar on Christian just war teaching, and has been very capably managing and publishing our journal. So Mark?
Thank you all very much for coming. A little bit of housekeeping, what we're doing. Obviously, we have a panel of 3. I will introduce them in just a moment. Afterwards, we'll have a period of time for Q&A that involves you. And then to close us out will be the Providence co-publisher and director of the Philos Project up in New York City, Robert Nicholson. But for now, it is my privilege, actually, one more thing. We've been talking about the magazine. If you haven't noticed, there's a table full of the magazine up there in the back. Feel free to grab a copy. Feel free to grab several copies and give your friends or mothers-in-laws or fathers-in-laws. Just distribute them widely and freely. We invite you to do that. So now it is my privilege to introduce 3 of our signatories. First up will be Paul Miller, who is a contributing editor at Providence, and as Mark Tooley has already stated, he was the primary drafter of our declaration. Paul is an associate director at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas in Austin. He previously served as the director for Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council staff for Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He also served in the Central Intelligence Agency in the U.S. Army, and he is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. His first book, Armed State Building, tackled the challenge of stabilization interventions, and his latest book, American Power and Liberal Order, addresses U.S. grand strategy, and I commend it to you and look for a review in a future issue of Providence. We also have John M. Owen, who is the Taylor Professor of Politics and a faculty fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He is author of The Clash of Ideas in World Politics, published in 2010, and Confronting Political Islam, published in 2015. He's published articles in Foreign Affairs, The New York Times, First Things, and a number of academic journals. Finally, we have Mary Haybeck. Mary Haybeck is a national security expert specializing in Afghanistan, extremism, and strategic planning. Dr. Haybeck teaches at SAIS Johns Hopkins, and at Georgetown. From 2008 to 2009, she was the special advisor for strategic planning at the National Security Council, on the National Security Council staff. Before joining SAIS, she taught military history and strategic thought at Yale. Among her many books is Knowing the Enemy, Jihadist Ideology and War on Terror, another volume that I commend to you. And with that, Paul is up.
Great. Thank you to Mark, and thank you, Mark, and thank you, Robert. Thank you to the Institute for Religion and Democracy and to the Fields Project and Providence Magazine for hosting this and gathering us all together. And thank you for coming out on a Tuesday evening to think together with us about a really important subject. American foreign policy is important and it affects a lot of people because, like it or not, the United States is still the predominantly powerful country in the world. And so how the United States uses its power affects human beings here and around the world. And that's what makes the use of that power such an important subject. It affects human beings everywhere. The idea for this declaration came, I think, in discussions with the Marks and the Roberts, thinking we needed to respond to some of the strains of thinking about American foreign policy that we had heard and seen in recent years. Let me read to you what I think is the central passage in the Declaration, and then offer a few comments on it. We say near the beginning, the routine work of foreign policy and maintenance of the international system might be considered a contemporary version of the creation mandate to cultivate the garden. That's from Genesis 2:15. The garden in question is the international social system, more concisely, world order. Cultivating the garden of world order means tending to the tasks that uphold public safety, execute justice, and promote human flourishing. And I think if I were to say what's the crux of our declaration, I'd point to that passage. They've been kind enough to characterize me as the lead drafter, so I give credit where it's due. I didn't write the key passage. Those couple of sentences actually came from Will and Bowden, so thanks to him for that. So we understand it to be an imperative for the United States, and I'd actually say for all countries, to use the power that they have to cultivate the garden of world order. We gear this declaration to American foreign policy because we're Americans, and also because of the predominant power the United States has. I think that this is a good thing for the United States to do, to lead the world towards, because first of all, it's in our own best interest, and we should be unembarrassed about that. I think foreign policy ought to be self-interested. We ought to aim at our own good. That's what governments are for. Liberal order, or I should say a world of order liberty, acts as an outer perimeter of our own security. And that's what makes it in our interest to cultivate world order. But secondly, we, I think, always ought to seek to use power responsibly. It's the Spider-Man doctrine of foreign policy. When you have great power, you have great responsibility. And we ought to seek to use our power responsibly. Let me read you a short quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. We reference Niebuhr once in the Declaration, but his influence is pervasive throughout. If you read it carefully, he wrote somewhere, "Great disproportions of power tempt the strong, the United States, to wield their power without too much consideration of the interests and views of those upon whom such power impinges." And I think that's a temptation the United States has often faced, that we are the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and we can sometimes be very insensitive to how our actions reverberate across the world. And that gives us an extra responsibility to be sensitive to the effects of our power, and also sensitive to the opportunities for using our power well. Now let me address maybe preemptively a few critiques that I anticipate. Why is this valid to make a religious declaration about foreign policy, or rather any policy at all? There's a strong group of commentators who would say it's invalid to inject morality into this discussion, specifically, especially a specifically religious morality, to say a Christian declaration on foreign policy. It's very common among realists to say that, or self-proclaimed realists. And they would say even that we undermine our position by injecting morality or idealism into our foreign policy. We're hurting ourselves. We're crimping ourselves. We need to act in an amoral way to get by in a world full of thugs and tyrants. So let me respond with a couple of disagreements with that position. First, I think that's actually very unrealistic. Despite the advocates saying that they are realists in saying so, I think it's actually unrealistic to expect amoral foreign policy. Citizens and policymakers are human beings, and human beings are moral beings. I sat in the White House Situation Room. I've listened to the debates with the President and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, and they are moral human beings. They actually want to do the right thing. It is very unrealistic to expect people to suddenly act as amoral automatons once they become policymakers. That's just not going to happen. And the American people expect and desire some kind of moral foundation for what we do in the world. If you go before the American people and say, we're going to be cold-hearted, ruthless killers, you might win one election, but you're not going to win a second or a third. I think the American people rightly expect that we should seek to act well in the world, to act for a long-term, just, and lasting peace among nations. Second response, I think that justice is actually an asset in our foreign policy. It helps undergird our foreign policy with a sense of legitimacy. If we seek to act justly, understanding we never will do perfectly, that makes it much easier for us to reach out and form alliances with like-minded nations around the world. It makes it much easier for us to act in ways that are perceived to be acceptable and legitimate by other states. And it gives us a way of framing our action that is more sustainable in the long run. Again, Reinhold Niebuhr, he says, a stable order is not possible without introducing instruments of justice into the agreements which are provided for order. He says, an unjust order quickly invites the resentment and rebellion which leads to its undoing. So if we want to have a sustainable posture in the world, it's good for it to be a just posture in the world. My third response is simply to say that just because we're framing this as a Christian declaration, that does not make this a theocratic position. I know that there are going to be some critics who say this is somehow invalid, it's a theocratic move to try to make a sectarian comment on foreign policy. What we're trying to do here is articulate norms of public justice. Our understanding of justice is drawn from a common faith, which most Americans share, but we don't think that justice is the exclusive possession of our faith, or that it's particular to our religious tradition. The viability of American ideals themselves depends upon finding common principles of justice that can be shared across communities. So we are here self-consciously identifying ourselves as Christians and saying this is our thought as Christians about foreign policy, but we don't think only Christians can agree with this. We think these are principles of justice that can and ought to be shared broadly. Let me stop there. During the Q&A time, if you'd like, I'd be happy to talk about why I think this is achievable. This is another line of objection I've heard, that aiming foreign policy at creating and fostering a liberal order around the world is sort of an overstretch because it's an unachievable goal. I think it is achievable, and I think that to that critic there, I'd say our difference is not one of theory or theology, but rather it's a different estimation of what is achievable. And so I have reasons for being a little optimistic about what can be achieved, drawn from my understanding of the last 2 centuries of history, as the United States, the United Kingdom, and others have built liberal order, but I'll save that conversation for later. Thanks.
Hello. I also would like to thank the organizers, the Institute on Religion and Democracy, the Philos Project, and I want to thank Paul Miller. Paul, as the principal drafter of the document, I suppose can't really praise it, but so let me do that with the same when I read it.
It was infallible, I think is the word I was looking for.
He wrote it as an ex-cathedra statement, so when I saw it, it was really like a breath of fresh air in an otherwise gloomy summer. So I want to make 2 points. First is one that Paul has already kind of pulled out a document. I'm pleased that you saw that as the core, because I felt that was also the crux of the document. It's this notion that there's a garden that needs tending. That's a metaphor and evocative. It's more than a metaphor. It really opens the door to some productive and I think right use of scripture to think about a situation, a world that's quite different from the world of the biblical writers. Let's face it, very, very different. We have a liberal international order, liberal not in the sense that Washington people use the word, but in the sense that political theorists use it, having to do with personal liberty. There are rules and practices that among countries, and now they include international organizations, NGOs, including religious ones, multinational corporations, rules of interaction that tell us who the actors are, what their rights and privileges are, what is out of bounds, and so on. This international order is hazy, and there are scholars, colleagues of mine who don't take it very seriously, but I think it is quite serious. It is real. It's a set of what we call social facts, and I think Christians really need to attend to this and ought to care about this, because it implicates, the international order implicates justice among the nations and within the nations and human flourishing. Now, I want to briefly recount the most consequential case in modern history of what happens when international order is not tended, or when it's tended, when it really becomes not a garden but a jungle, because certain actors step out, namely the United States, and others step in. I have in mind the interwar period between the two world wars, 1920s and 1930s, an episode in world history that ended as badly as any episode ever has. Now, in the first instance, this is a story of Hitler and Mussolini and Japanese militarism and aggressive imperialism and World War. And some might think that that was it. That's all you need to say. Some bad actors, really evil, and finally stopped by Western democracies and the Soviet Union, and that is true. But as Winston Churchill himself wrote in his memoirs later, in his history of the Second World War, this is also a story of abdication by the Western democracies. France, Britain, and the United States, an abdication that enabled these bad actors and their bad policies, and a really awful global order to emerge and start to become dominant. The United States was not thoroughly isolationist during this period, as is sometimes said. It was deeply involved in Latin America and the Caribbean in a very heavy-handed way until 1933 and FDR's good neighbor policy. This is, by the way, U.S. behavior in the Western Hemisphere is a cautionary note that I appreciate bringing Niebuhr into the document. And we can talk about this later if you like. But the United States in the interwar period was aloof from Europe. And that was extremely important. The fate of global order still hung in the 1930s on Europe. Europe still had the bulk of industrial and military potential even after the First World War. But the First World War devastated Europe. There was a lost generation of young men. The countries were heavily indebted to the United States. They were asking the United States to step up and take leadership. But far too many Americans wanted nothing to do with Europe after the First World War. The Great War had left a bad taste in their mouths, and so the United States refused to join the League of Nations, or really to do much renegotiating of the treaty, to perhaps open the door to joining. In the 1920s, the United States raised tariff barriers, and then again in 1930, the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was a 59.1% tariff on dutiable imports. This, most historians agree, deepened the Great Depression, which started in this country, of course. It led other states to follow suit with tariffs of their own, starting with Canada. It led other countries to start competitive devaluations of their currencies, trying to beef up their exports. When everyone devalues, you have disorder and everybody loses. The Depression and the depth and length of the Depression did contribute to, in major ways, to a couple of things. The rise of fascism across Europe, and fascist flirtations even in Latin America, in Argentina, Brazil, and elsewhere, to militarism in Japan. And second, it also led to the drive to autarky or self-sufficiency and formal aggressive empire by Germany, Japan, and Italy, this gobbling up of smaller countries that they did, eventually wreaking such havoc on so much of the world, mostly Eastern Europe and East Asia, but elsewhere, of course. So a different kind of order emerged in the 1930s. It wasn't that, oh, we can have order or not, or there's no such thing as international order. There was an identifiably very different kind of order. As I said, not a garden, but a jungle. And this happened not entirely because the United States, I would say, abdicated, but U.S. abdication, aloofness played a role. Americans told themselves that Europe was across the sea, Asia was across an even bigger sea. These are not our problems. We're not going to get fooled again. We're protected by the oceans, and let's let these warlike Europeans work things out themselves. This is the America First movement, and it is instructive. Again, our world is very different from the 1930s, but this is the only case we have of a powerful United States that withdrew. In the 19th century, the U.S. wasn't powerful and couldn't have played this role. In the 20s and 30s, we could have, and we did. Second point I want to make, and I'm not even keeping time, so can I make it? Okay, I'll make my second point.
What's the time?
All right. Second point, though, is an acknowledgement of one kind of objection that many Christians might lodge against this notion that the United States has global responsibilities. And to sum up the objection is that in practice, this sounds good in theory, maybe, but in practice, America generally does more harm than good. And there are a number of versions of this. One is that we are actually violent too. We are, in fact, we are imperialists. Look at all the wars we're fighting. Think about the Iraq War. Think of the pictures of Abu Ghraib. Think about the Vietnam War, which shaped the previous generation. Very similar discourse about that. Think about our support for authoritarian governments even now in the Middle East. Another version that's a little newer that a lot of Christians I know are voicing is that the liberal global order, if you like, the garden that the United States is tending, is actually harmful. Perhaps it was helpful in the past to human flourishing and justice, but it's become harmful, at least in some of its aspects. And that's because liberalism itself in the Western world has changed. Our notions of human rights haven't really expanded, they have shifted. And let me try to characterize the shift succinctly. At the time of the American founding, 240 some years ago, we could call the liberalism that really didn't come into currency until the 19th century. Let's call it liberalism. Thomas Jefferson, founder of my university, James Madison. Liberalism saw the chief threat to individual liberty, which was essential good for liberals, as emanating from the despotic state. The chief threat to individual liberty came from the state, the despotic state. So that's phase one. Phase two liberalism, we could say, began to emerge in the late 19th century. It really dominated the 20th century. And phase two liberalism said that the chief threat to individual liberty comes from what Marx called capital. We could think of big business banks that run roughshod over the rights of workers. And so liberalism, and think of the New Deal as really the prime example of this in the United States, recruited the now tamed state, no longer despotic, to mitigate the threat to individual liberty from capital. That's phase two. There are still people who hold to this view of liberalism, but becoming more dominant has been what I call phase three liberalism, in which the chief threats to individual liberty are taken to come not from the despotic state, which has been tamed, not from capital, which has also been tamed, but from traditional institutions and norms, including churches, synagogues, mosques, the traditional family, even the nation state itself. And now, the state and capital are being recruited to mitigate these supposed threats to individual liberty. So this, of course, is going on within the United States. But let's be frank, we are exporting this kind of liberalism abroad, and it's natural we should do so. And some Christians are rightly troubled by this. So the plants, we're tending a garden, and it has many nice, beautiful plants, but it also has some what appear to many of us to be weeds. And this is a problem. All I can say in response to this objection, which I take very seriously, is that yes, it is a problem. It's a problem, though, I think that the church can address by working in society. The United States is still a democracy. I believe in a grand project of trying to reconvert the West to Christianity, and this is something we ought to be doing in our churches and in our individual lives. In any case, this objection, I still maintain, does not outweigh the problem I described in my first point, that if the United States, for all its flaws and all the problematic notions of liberalism we're enacting and exporting, if the U.S. does withdraw, it won't be a replay of the 30s, but it will be more like the 30s than what we have now. And we, as Christians, we need to think very, very hard about that. So, thank you.
Thanks. I'm hoping that I'll be even more succinct. I have 4 points, so I'll try and keep myself to the time limit. The first point that I'd like to make is about why this is needed now. I think we've all noticed that there are a lot of divisions in our country, and at least some of these divisions are over foreign policy. There are divisions between left and right, there are divisions amongst elites over what we should be doing in the world, and there's a lot of divisions actually between elites and ordinary Americans about how we should be interacting in the world. This has affected Christians as much as anybody else in our country, and there are a lot of divisions within the Christian community that are very large about what the role of the United States is, how we should be interacting with others, what justice means. We use the term justice as if this has a common agreed upon definition, but in fact that's highly contested. So there's all sorts of divisions within the Christian community, just as there is within America writ large. But at the same time, it has never been more important for us to have some common ground to act together because of the way that the world has developed over the past 15 years in particular. I remember, as I'm sure most of you in the room do, the sort of hopes and dreams of the 1990s with this new world order that was going to lead to peace and prosperity, and globalization was going to even out and smooth out all the problems around the world. And there was just going to be this kind of internationalization of American values, how one defines that, or international values, as some people put it, and peace and prosperity, as they said, would break out. But those hopes have not been met, and for the past 15 years, we have seen a violence gather itself and sort of spill out, especially across the greater Middle East, but really around the world. And that violence is not remaining confined over there, but is in fact affecting us and many of our partners and friends. So never has it been more necessary for us to have some sort of common ground on which we can build. So I would say that that's one of the main reasons for writing a document like this. The analogy, the second point I'd like to make is that the analogy of the 1930s also came to me, so this was one of those kind of nice coincidences. When I was thinking about why this is needed now. As John pointed out, there was a time of rising, what everybody calls, at least in the historical profession, revisionist powers, and a decline in the power of the status quo nations. Or, in the case of the United States, a failure to lead or a decision not to lead. In fact, the United States looked very much like today. It was economically wounded, disillusioned by engagement with the world. It had gone out there and attempted to bring democracy to Europe, and in fact it had led to failure and to pretty much a worse world than when the United States had started. And there was a tendency on the part of a lot of Americans to simply withdraw, kind of lick our wounds, take care of our own issues, and let the rest of the world take care of itself. And there was also a significant divide at that time between northeastern elites, kind of what later became called the establishment, and ordinary Americans. A lot of ordinary Americans didn't want to get engaged in the world. Northeastern elites believed it was necessary, but the arguments that they made did not resonate with ordinary Americans. And they were just like, we don't want to get involved. Why can't the rest of the world take care of their own problems, fix their own problems? Why do we always have to be getting engaged? So a lot of the kind of discussions that were going on in the 1930s in particular sound very familiar to conversations that one has heard over the past few years in the United States. And if one compares our reaction to Iraq with what happened after World War I, it becomes apparent that our engagement in both of these places and our belief that we had failed in both of these places has a large role to play. The third thing that strikes me about why, so the analogy of the 1930s helps to explain why when the United States chooses to disengage, it often leads not to the better world that we're hoping for, but in fact can lead to more disorder and more violence rather than to less disorder, less violence. And that brings me to the third point I'd like to make, which this is again completely without having any conversation. With great power comes great responsibility is what I have written here. I actually use that phrase all the time before the Spider-Man movies back in the 1990s because only people who actually read the comic books would know the reference. I'm not saying who read graphic novels. But it struck me in the 1990s even that we were sort of making some decisions about the use of our power that it was better for us to not engage. That in fact, every time we engaged, we seemed to make things worse. And it was best for us to kind of lead from behind. Even in the 1990s, that was a thought that a lot of people were having. But doing nothing is also a choice, right? And one with great risks attached to it. Others will act in our place. So if we choose to do nothing, others will decide to do what they want to do. And we also have seen, not just over the past few years, but also during the 1990s, when the U.S. doesn't lead, no one steps in and says, hey, we'll take over, take charge, let us do it. The international community included, right? The UN included, our alliances included. And finally, if we decide that we should sort of, okay, let's empower others that we're friends with, we're partners with, our allies, what actually happens is that our partners achieve their ends and interests and not things that we actually believe are right and just. So that choice also leads to, or has attached to it, significant risks. So my concluding point is there are rarely perfect choices. Sometimes it's very clear, right? There's a genocide going on, or you have clear evidence that these people want to take over the world and they have to be stopped, right? But often, rather than you having clear choices, it's more a matter of the least bad choice. And sometimes that's acting, sometimes that's not acting, sometimes it's acting in one way or another way, but it's never a clear sort of, hey, everybody can tell, in choices A through Z, what we really should be doing is either L or M. Instead, it's often a matter of judgment. But at the same time, and this is in complete opposition to that, there sometimes is a choice before us about acting that is so difficult that it requires a great deal of political or sometimes just moral courage in order to take that action. Here, I'm reminded, of Daniel and his choices, his moral choices for courage, and especially the phrase from one of his three friends when they're faced with a really difficult choice of life and death, and their decision to do it with the phrase, but if not. So sometimes it's not a matter of not knowing what to do, of having unclear choices in front of you, but knowing what to do and simply needing to have moral courage to choose to do the right thing. And of course, I'll conclude by saying, seeing the difference between those is knowing when one applies where the other applies is the whole of wise leadership. Thank you.
So now, you know, we've got the questions. There's a mic here, so maybe if you just line up, that would be the easiest way to do it. Kind of first come, first serve. One admonition, please remember that a question is a short interrogative. If you could honor that more in the observance and less in the breach, that would be appreciated. Please.
Hello, I just have one quick question.
And please introduce yourself.
I'm William Cable from Internet and Heritage Foundation. Liberal international order, especially liberal international groups like the UN, the last 30, 50 years have been progenies of a lot of liberal social principles. How can the United States simultaneously participate in those things while distancing itself from those principles?
Yeah, so maybe a note on terminology. By talking about liberal order, I don't at all mean to endorse all the program of the Liberal Internationalist School of IR Scholarship or contemporary political liberalism, the political left. That's not quite the terms that I would choose. When we talk about liberal order, I actually think that we better talk about order liberty, right? The United States wants to foster a cultural order liberty around the world. That might be a better way of putting it. There are particular institutions in the world today, like the United Nations, like UNESCO, that are accretions on intergovernmental organizations and accretions on liberal order that might be a little unhelpful or not very useful. And I don't think that means the United States should stop participating in the UN, but we should recognize realistically what it's actually useful for and recognize that sometimes it can be a little unhelpful as well. And we should use such tools as the UN carefully and wisely. We should stay, I think we should stay in the UN, absolutely, but we should have somewhat limited expectations for what it can really do. It does a great job with refugee camps. It does a great job as being a forum for multilateral diplomacy. But I don't really expect it to kind of solve those problems.
I would just add that nobody gets their way completely in the UN, and the temptation of the United States has is, well, we're so powerful, do we really need the UN, or should we? Why are we hosting it in New York? Smaller countries don't get their way either. They're small and they're not tempted in that direction. So I think we should recognize what's going on. We're tempted to leave. But I agree with Paul, leaving would be a bad idea. That's why we haven't done it. Even under presidents that didn't like the UN much, we stayed in, and there were real reasons for that.
Tyler O'Neill with PJ Media. I'd just like to ask you, two of you brought up the issue of the 1930s, how the U.S. specifically decided to withdraw from especially European international relations, and that had negative effects. I'm wondering, is there a threat you see today that's commensurate, perhaps Russia, perhaps ISIS, perhaps radical Islamic terror, that Christians should unite against and find as a rallying cry? Because it seems that many Christians who disagree with your call to get more involved would say that there isn't that existential threat out there. And I'd like to hear how you respond.
Well, I hesitate to look for, you said, a threat commensurate with the 1930s. Well, I don't think, no, not yet. But I think it might be a mistake to wait until we see a threat that's just like the 1930s. This kind of historical analogy is going to be useful, but trying to push it too far and find an exact analogy can be a little unhelpful. I think there's lots of threats to the United States and to cultural order liberty around the world today. I'd say the the aggression of the nuclear autocracies like Russia, China, North Korea, put you on that category, is definitely a threat. Are they as aggressive and as totalitarian as the Nazis were? No. Yeah, but no. Then you have the threat from lots and lots of non-state groups, terrorists, jihadists, drug traffickers, organized criminals, pirates, slavers, barbarians at the gates. They're all over the place. And individually, they're quite small threats, but in aggregate, it costs a lot to manage that problem. And so we absolutely should be actively involved against all kinds of threats, recognizing that the toll they take on human flourishing, even where they are now. And if we aren't involved in proactively engaging and fighting against them, it will get worse.
I couldn't agree more with Paul's description of this. The historians up here are very cautious about trying to put an analogy directly at the top. But the significant things about the analogy are the growing power of people who are dissatisfied with the way things are, and the waning power or the withdrawing from engagement of those who want to maintain the international order, the garden, and keep it flourishing. So that leads to not just one or two threats, but a whole range of threats. So if you go back to the 1930s, we all focus on the Nazis as being the threat, right? But in fact, you had, of course, Mussolini, you had Stalin, you had the Japanese Empire, you had the rise in power of a whole bunch of wannabes, of imitators of these people from Eastern Europe all the way through China. And across the vast majority of the landmass of the entire world, you had highly populators of disorder and violence that was unprecedented. So it really didn't sort of focus in on just the Nazis and the Japanese Empire until rather late in the game, because there were so many threats during the 1920s and 30s that slowly but surely, without management by somebody or some collection of powers or some international order, got out of control.
Let me jump, just a quick point. I agree with what they said. I think it's a great question. The analogy is imperfect, like all analogies. I do want to emphasize that the fascism emerged when the more it was clear that the United States was building terror barriers, and their route to national prosperity and sovereignty had to be through imperialism rather than trade. That's when things got worse. So we are, if you want to get overly precise, we're more like 1930 than 1936. There are actors out there who, and I would group the Chinese, if the Chinese really conclude that that open trading order, under which they've done amazingly well, is starting to close up, they'll have to turn to other means to secure their energy future, their economic future, and that's a terrible Asian order we're looking at. So, and that's something the United States has some say over, both in keeping the sea lanes open and in keeping its alliances and reassuring other regional actors. So in other words, the U.S. has a role in exactly the emergence of these threats.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Meyer. I wanted to pick up actually on a couple of things that have already been raised. One is something that Professor Hayback mentioned. I have been for many years hearing the word justice thrown around, and it's been used here quite a bit. I'd like to get some meat on those bones. What do you mean by justice? That's the first one. Another quick question is, I would contend that we have overused this 1930s analogy ad nauseum, that you have to understand power in context. And our context now, today, is nothing like the 1930s. The position of the United States, the position of other powers, the rise of non-state actors, the whole context is different. And yet I think that's a real weakness in your position, that you can transfer these historical epics from one period to another. So just on those two things.
What is justice? I do thankfully, we didn't need to define the words in declaration. So, I think that, for my part, I'm happy to be a little deliberately vague because we're trying to offer something that can be the grounds for a consensus for agreement, right? We want to reach out and find agreement on some principles of public policy, in this case foreign policy, that Americans across the spectrum can agree upon. And so if it promotes human flourishing and order and security and liberty, that's a pretty good package of things to be associated with justice. Notice that I'm not defining it very clearly, and that's on purpose, because I think we all like liberty and order and security and flourishing. And if we all like that, we can agree on those things, that can be a good political package that for creating consensus. That's my best answer on justice. For a longer conversation as I did. Or justice?
I was thinking that certainly during the 1960s it was overused. But in fact, today it's been pretty much forgotten. And it's not overused today. It's in fact the lessons that we once learned in the 1930s have gone away. So the 60s were dominated by conversations about appeasement and Munich and how we have to stand up to communism everywhere, especially in Vietnam, which was one of the main arguments for getting engaged in Vietnam back in the 1960s. Talk about your overuse. It really did get overused in the 60s and somewhat into the early 70s, but it kind of went away because people realized it had been overused. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was one attempt to bring it back, and that was by George H.W. Bush in talking about the invasion of Kuwait and the need to not to stand up to tyranny, to stand up to aggression. And it was pretty much poo-pooed, because it was like, there's no comparison between Saddam and Hitler, right? And so there was a lot of people who I think were very turned against using that particular analogy in any way, shape, or form because of the disasters of the 60s. But the result is that we've kind of thrown out some of the things we learned from that period as well. We kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater. So you're not going to have that analogy used at all in any context. And when you have somebody like ISIS that are literally enslaving people and carrying out genocide, what better way, who else do we have in order to analogize with than the people of the 20th century who tried to do exactly the same thing? So I really do believe that, in fact, we underutilize it today in reaction to the way it was overused in the 1960s.
And analogies are, yeah, right. All limited. The Vietnam analogy with Iraq is similarly limited. I'm the one who brought it up, although Mary coincidentally drew it in as well. So behind my use of that analogy was just pedagogical. Behind the analogy lies a well-developed body of theory in international relations called hegemonic stability theory that says that global public goods need someone to pay for them. Now, not all scholars accept this. Some scholars think, no, you don't need hegemonic power to do it, but a lot think you do. And they use the 30s as their main case study, but there's there's quite a bit of logic behind the theory coming out of institutional economics, and so don't worry, I'm going to stop talking. I'm not going to give a lecture on that. But there's more at work here than just a very imperfect analogy. There's actually there are a lot of reasons to think that U.S. withdrawal could lead to some bad outcomes that have nothing to do with the 30s analogy. Justice is not the right of the stronger. I can say that.
Proven.
Can I ask a question now? I'm Augustus Salzona. I'm a current supporter of Donald Trump for president, and my family has been long ties to various governments here, foreign governments. We've been in Washington, D.C. since 1955. We've seen presidents come and go, Philippine ambassadors come and go, Philippine presidents come and go. I'm a native of the Philippines, an immigrant here. So from my perspective, I did want to ask a question. If you were if you had Donald Trump's ear, and if you were to advise Donald Trump towards the United States having a more pro-Christian foreign policy, however you wish to define that, what would you advise him if you had his ear? And I'm going to sit down and speak.
Well, to clarify, first, I think I would not want to promote, I wouldn't want to say anybody should have a pro-Christian foreign policy, domestic policy. I'd say pro-justice, right? We're standing here as Christians, are going to say justice is drawn from our faith, but I'd say, you know, I want our policies to promote justice. Having advised a couple of presidents in my capacity, and Mary and I have some other stories to tell on this as well. What would I say if I had either Trump or Clinton's here? I'd say that I am concerned that we collectively are overreacting to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, so we all know the famous quote: "Those who don't know the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat the errors of the past." Right? And then Robert Jervis has said, "Those who do learn the lessons of the past are doomed to make the opposite mistake." And I think that's kind of what's going to happen. I think that, to speak frankly, this is just for myself, I'm speaking for everybody else on stage, my assessment is that President Obama has overlearned the lessons of the recent past. He has looked at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think his calculation is we need to do less than more. And so if I was to say anything to President Obama or to any of the candidates, I'd say, let's not overlearn those lessons. Let's understand that just because we messed up a few times, doesn't mean we should stop trying in the future. Past failure, using past failures to lower our moral ambition in the future is the exact wrong response. I think actually we should learn from the mistakes of the past how to do better in the future. So the recent past doesn't disprove the validity or usefulness of internationalism, of being engaged in the world. It just means we need to do a better job. And that's what I say to Trump, to Clinton, to anybody who listens.
Thank you.
Hey, hi, my name is Matthew Aquino from the Charles Koch Institute. I'm curious as to how all of you think the Christian community can try to work with the Muslim community to stop the spread of radicalism. ISIS keeps on growing, and after Al-Qaeda backs away, ISIS seems to come up, and now there's a threat of smaller groups who could possibly replace ISIS if ISIS is defeated. Thank you.
That's a terrific question, and one I've been thinking about for about nearly 20 years. So, wow. Probably the biggest things or obstacles I see out there are a lack of information, lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding sort of on both sides. So the main thing I think is needed is more interaction, more contact, more spending time getting to know each other's beliefs, what they're like as people, and less isolation and separatism. That's true across the United States, by the way. What we're seeing is everybody isolating into their own specific little communities where they're comfortable, online as much as in real life, and not interacting with people who think or look or talk differently than you do. And so I feel that across the board, we need that. But there's also some specific kinds of knowledge that I think are necessary as well. So within the Christian community, the biggest, because I can speak most clearly to the Christian community side of things rather than the Muslim community, what I see is a kind of lumping of everybody who is Muslim into one sort of, here they are, the group, the community, the Muslim community, they're all pretty much the same, they all think the same, they have the same basic belief system. And that's no more true of Muslims than it is of Christians. There are huge differences within that community, just as there are within the Christian community. And especially on the Sunni side, it's sort of like Protestantism. There's actually nobody in charge, and there's things like denominations, but there's nobody who you can point to and say, that's the guy who's like in charge of, and the analogy would be with the evangelical, side of Christianity. Like, if you want to speak with the person who's in charge of evangelical Christianity in the United States, I bet if I asked evangelicals in this room to name that person, I'd get like 20 different names, right? And it's the same thing with the Muslim community. So there's huge differences. And the second thing that I would say is not well understood is that the extremists are primarily targeting ordinary Muslims and not Christians, not the infidels at all. So there's been quite a lot of studies on this that show that their primary focus and target is in fact converting other Muslims to their views, their specific views of Islam. Their primary focus of their violence is Muslims, Sunni Muslims, not even Shia. The primary, if you just look at the numbers, in 2009, the last time a complete study was done, 8 times as many Muslims as non-Muslims had been killed by Al-Qaeda at that point with their violence, their terrorist violence. That doesn't include the insurgent violence, which is even more so. It's like 20 to 100 times, depending on the country, more Muslims are being killed. So I don't think that's well understood. And in fact, the entire focus of their strategy is aimed at other Muslims rather than at the non-Muslim group. And the third thing I think is not well understood is just how small the extremist contingent is and just how extreme they are. So there's, my own numbers, 0.0125% of Muslim community. So 1.7 billion people, that's a lot of people. So in that small percentage, you still end up with a couple 100,000 people. But that is a tiny, teeny tiny little number. And the form of Islam that they're putting forward is not from the 7th century or the 8th century or the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. It is from specifically the 13th century and one theologian, period. That's the only guy that they follow, one theologian from the 13th century. And his disciples after that were entirely marginalized within the Muslim community at large, and in fact ended up being pushed off into the Arabian Peninsula where they languished for hundreds of years until they were revived in the 18th century. So just that kind of information might be very helpful, I think, to the Christian community in thinking about how to reach out to Muslims, to see them as the primary target here, and as more threatened by this, what I call a cult, than even we are.
If I may interject before the next question, if you want another answer to that, that was a very good one. Thank you, Mary. If I can commend you over here, we have a friend and ally, Tafiq Hamid, and I'm not going to give him the microphone because we'll be here all night. I've heard him speak before, it's excellent. But corner him during the reception. He's written a book, it's available in the back, I believe, for purchase, called Inside Jihad. He has an insider's perspective. Don't worry, he's not on the outside. But he's well worth speaking with, so I commend him to you.
It's my pleasure.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, Brandon Showalter with the Christian Post. There seems to me to be, at least among millennials, this reflexive knee-jerk pacifism in response to questions about foreign policy. And this is a Christian declaration about a very complex subject, and maybe it's just my perception of it, but it seems to be the words of Jesus, the red letters, are more commensurate with dovish foreign policy, and any kind of use of force or any kind of armed conflict is against the teachings of Christ. Anabaptist, my roots are Mennonite, by the way. We were taught that just war theory was a heresy from the pit of hell. And so, can you speak to this, how Christians can sort of bring this thoughtful, theological vision for engaging nations and intervening where we must, because indeed other bad actors will intervene if we don't. framing this from a gospel-centered perspective.
Mark, do you want to take that one? I guess I'm going to jump in a little bit here. I commend long reading of Providence initially. That's the first thing. With the red letter movement, obviously that is that's one of the, I think Mark Tully noted, that's one of the prevailing inclinations that we're trying to press against. I think that the scriptures include, obviously, more in the red letters, which is to suggest that the teachings of Christ include something more than the red letters. I think if you start from the beginning, go through Genesis, and our human responsibilities made in the image of God, to exercise dominion, which is care, providential care, not incidental, over creation. And what you're going to find is you work through the Psalms and the poetry of the Apocalypse and the epistles. And if you take the comprehensive picture of Scripture, what you're going to end up with is a portrait of Jesus that is an example of not baptism. I think among the young, they're not necessarily blamed because they're elders that taught them for them. But I think we mistake what love is. I believe we believe that love is simply desiring other people's happiness, and happiness not in Aristotelian sense of actual flourishing, which is a word that's been rightly used several times. I think we think happiness is some sort of gassy, pleasure, rather than something that allows for genuine human flourishing. And that's only a partial answer, right? If we exercise dominion as beings made in the image of God, and we have to be concerned for human flourishing. And again, use the historic analogy. The 20th century, if nothing else has, teaches us that things tend not to flourish on their own in this world because of the condition of the human heart. And somebody has to do something, it seems to me, to promote flourishing. And I think that there's arguments that could be made, maybe during the reception, that suggest that the just war tradition, probably not quite from the pit of hell, maybe from Hippo, or Rome or elsewhere, suggests that the use of force, the prevention of somebody from doing an act of evil, is, first of all, good for the person who's being prevented from doing that act of evil. I've written somewhat extensively a long dissertation and a couple of articles here on the notion that one can, in fact, love their enemies to death. I think it's in this issue, so commendable in fact. It's intentionally supposed to be provocative, so if I've succeeded on the grunts, then that's a good thing. It's a complex issue, but I don't believe the words of Christ are limited to red letters. And even frankly, in the red letters, you don't see anybody in Scripture talking about hell more than Jesus. You don't see anybody in Scripture resenting evil, which is a retributive response to what is not right in the world, more than Jesus. There's a difference I get between blowing up an enemy and using harsh language toward them. But both are somewhere on the spectrum of resentment. On November 4th, we're going to be showing, I hope if it all comes together, we haven't actually signed a contract yet, but we're going to be having a private screening of Hacksaw Ridge, which is Mel Gibson's latest film about the conscientious objector Desmond Doss. And the film is a wonderful example of courage, which I think is less a film about pacifism than it is about one pacifist's moral and physical valor. But the movie is problematic in the sense that I don't think it allows somebody who is squared their military activity with their faith to feel like their view is being represented. So we're going to show the film and commend the film. It's a wonderful film. But we're going to talk about some of those issues there as well. So be on the lookout for advertising about that. And then I can give another shout out to, if I may, another signatory of the document, Chaplain Colonel Timothy Mallard is in the back. And he has had to answer this kind of question over and over and over again in kinetic environments where life is on the line. So I commend him to you as well, corner him at the reception.
Very briefly, I know we're running short of time. I found, you raised a generational question on millennials. In my teaching of undergraduates, I find a lot of sentimental pacifists who are pacifists by emotion, by feeling, by gut, but not convictional pacifists, because they don't want to go where that kind of thinking leads them. And as soon as you raise the cliched examples about the Nazis, they are no longer pacifists. So the reductive ad Hitlerum is very useful for that.
Thank you.
I'm Susan Hartford, and I'm with Jubilee Faithful, and I don't have my glasses, but let me try this. As compared to the 1930s, do you think today there's an order of complication because of technology and global infrastructure that makes tending this garden even more difficult? And related to that then is, even if, for instance, on social media, we Christians are just sniping at each other and faulting each other and just sort of going in a vicious circle, how do we deal with this? Is Providence Magazine one of our tools? But anything you can answer would be helpful.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say more difficult in different ways. And, you know, Christians always snipe at each other. We shoot our wounded, you know, let's see. So for example, one of the encouraging things I think that's happened in the global church is more cooperation, dialogue between Catholic and evangelical Christians. Didn't happen in the 30s, right? Didn't happen in the 50s or 60s. It really is a pretty recent thing. So I believe by the power of the Holy Spirit we have overcome that very harmful fissure, probably as much as you're going to for a while. But we have other ones, right? You know, you're right. We snipe each other, maybe on a more micro sense because of social media, because it's information technology is so different. But I would hesitate to say, well, let's see. A few years ago, people thought the internet was going to change everything for the better. It has changed a lot of things, some for the better, some for the worse. So I would just characterize it as a different set of challenges we need to be attuned to. And I would group your very good question under this general heading that we're getting a lot of that's helpful. The 30s are an analogy, but only an analogy. I think we can't push too far. Maybe I was silly when I was saying we're in 1930, not 1930. You know, we're not in 1930 either. We're in 2016. But there are some structural similarities. But then we have some very different situations, including the generational challenge that you brought. This is, of course, secular millennials as well as Christian millennials, which is telling you something. This is not just a Christian. We have our red letter version, but it's generally a millennial phenomenon, and that's significant stuff.
Okay, I think we have time.
Well, we just kind of take them all the questions, and then we can go through it.
Okay, so you could each ask a question, and then our panel will.
Sure. So Samuel Laurie with Christians United for Israel on campus, and my question is, in order to achieve, you know, kind of this world order and the objectives, if you guys, what you think the best strategy would be, if it's kind of offshore balancing, what you guys think about that, strengthening our allies, you know, like Israel and the Middle East, and our European partners in Europe to balance Russia and the Pacific Rim, you know, Japan, South Korea. What if you guys think that that's a viable strategy, and how we kind of prevent from imperial overstretch while we're trying to do good and maintain our call in the world.
My name is Daniel Yoon. I work at the Ad Center, a defense industry consultancy. My question to you, I'd like to specifically express my appreciation for certain lines in the declaration that say there is no perfect human political system in the world, that the objective of a Christian-minded foreign policy is not utopianism, and that liberalism is the least flawed international system in the world. But I suppose my question there is, how do you reconcile the advantages of a liberal international order with the reality that the fundamental tenets of liberalism are frankly, for those of us who at least affirm the inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture, nowhere to be found in Scripture the concept of self-determination, of free trade. None of these are inherently, foundationally scriptural. I understand that you're trying to build an ecumenical movement here. I suppose my question is, how far is the Declaration willing to go in affirming that creating a just world order, in meeting out a just foreign policy is not the ultimate good? That creation care is not the ultimate good. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mitsuo Nakai, member of Reagan Foundation. Regarding North Korea, we have a problem. What do you recommend if I ask you how we are going to, or how we can unify the Korean Peninsula? Some experts are saying regime change, but that's a nasty one. So I just wanted to find out your opinions on that.
Thank you.
Hi, Tara Jones with Department of Defense. Kind of starting to wonder if I'm the only current person in the room. My question really is kind of for you, Paul. You set it up at the beginning. I was surprised no one asked you to explain your idea for how this is realistic. Coming from inside the government, where I had a Canadian JAG actually say one time, when the United States engages, it generally gets what it wants, which was a little surprising to hear from one of our closest allies that sort of, but not in our government, say, you guys really actually can get what you want when you engage. Part of the challenge is, I think, as an enormous bureaucracy led by political appointees who are here for a minute and then change out, we have a hard time coming to what is the United States government's position in order to engage. And so I'd be very interested in your thoughts on just what you think is, and how realistic this foreign policy is. And I owe your wife a text message answer, so.
Very well, friend. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the good questions. Let me tackle the first and fourth, because they're, I think, essentially the same question. What's the best strategy for trying to achieve this in the world? How do we avoid overstretch? How is this realistic? I've just written a book on that. So pardon me while I self-promote that. So that's my answer. It's so if you'll pardon me, this will only take a few hours. And I wish I had a shorter answer. There's no formula. There's no bumper sticker. There's no catchphrase that I have for you that kind of captures how to do this right, how to avoid overstretch, how to make it feasible, how to make it cost effective, and still have a bumper sticker for you. That's why I wrote 300 pages on it. One thing that I'd like to see, and this is getting a little in the weeds, is a reform to the decision-making apparatus of the U.S. government. Again, I served on the NSC staff. You're not. And Mary, you probably have some thoughts on this too. And worked in government for a decade, and I think the way we make decisions is a little broken, it's a little uncoordinated, and it has not served presidents well. It's not a partisan issue. I think I saw President Bush make a few mistakes. I think I saw President Obama make a few mistakes. And I think that we can have a better system for staffing options, for generating information, raising it to the appropriate level. I think Eisenhower actually had a pretty good system. I think Kennedy threw it out. So from my view, I think that might be a really good investment to make for the next administration. I recommend the next administration pay attention to the decision-making apparatus and interagency system in the U.S. government. Got lots to say in the questions, but let me
No, I think just on the fourth one, because it's something I've been actually thinking about a lot in a sort of strategic sense. That one of the huge challenges that our country is facing, and not just us, it's actually, I think, a Western European, maybe global problem, is these divisions amongst elites. So, and between elites and ordinary citizens. So one of the things that really strikes someone like me, looking back at, let's say, 2009, is that I have colleagues who gave speeches and wrote articles arguing that President Obama coming in would look at the international system and the international situation and come to basically the same conclusions that they had come to. And therefore, national, sort of our national interests are an agreed upon thing. And he would see this as a kind of eternal national interest. And these would then remain as the sort of goals, objectives for the United States to maintain. And I think these colleagues have never been more shocked in their lives when, people in the Obama administration came to different conclusions about what our national interests are and the objectives that the United States should be. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I definitely have this with close friends and colleagues. So that, it suggests that, not to be a very dead horse, but the analogy of the 1930s is one kind of analogy that one can look at, where there was again this kind of divide that was going on about what America should be. But there's been other times in our history where we've been similarly divided, and I've recently been thinking about don't take this wrong way, but the 1850s, which was the last time we had a really serious divide between elites in the United States. And some elites thought the United States should be one thing, and some had a completely different vision of what the United States should be. And a lot of people look back at these sort of halcyon days of the Cold War. And I'm old enough to remember the 70s and 80s. And the 70s and 80s elites were hugely divided, hugely divided. That all went away in 1968. So there was no agreement amongst the elites about what should be done about the Soviet Union, world communism, did it even exist, the whole concept of détente, arms treaties, all that stuff, working with the Soviet Union rather than seeking to confront it. There was huge disagreements, and that's really from 60, basically from 48 to 68 there was agreement, 20 years of agreement, and after that it all fell apart. And it just has never been put back together. And we're still arguing about what the United States should be. So to me, this is a huge strategic issue. And so then you create the problem of the United States heading down, strongly down one way, and the new administration comes in and suddenly you do a complete reverse and you head the other, and our allies are all getting whiplash from this. So this is a huge problem, and I don't obviously have a solution, but I can point out what I think is the problems. By the way, just in terms of decision-making within government, those of us who've had any exposure to the interagency process understand that process is broken. It's not just, it's got some minor issues, it is completely broken. A colleague of mine argued that dysfunction within government is actually highly functioning, but for different purposes than originally intended by the president or whoever's. So that dysfunction that's going on is because of these disagreements being expressed within government. There's huge disagreement. And there is a solution to it, an easy solution. Easy. I'll tell you what the easy solution is. It'll never happen, but it's the easy solution. How many people were in Kissinger's national security staff?
How many people counted? Just one.
No. How many people did he have helping them to try to bring peace to the Middle East, end the war in Vietnam, open up China, end the war, détente?
Good question.
15. Today we have what?
500, 400? I don't even know if there's an answer to that question. So the easy answer would be to, if you really want to have swift, I'm not saying good, but if you want to have swift decision-making, chop everything down to the size it was in, I don't know, the 1950s or 40s or something. You'll have swift decision. I'm not saying it'll be good decision, but you'll have fast. There will be no interagency problems. This could be so small.
Depending on some of the liberalism and scripture.
I can clean up here, I guess. With North Korea, I don't know. But I don't think unilateral action by the U.S. is indicated. And I think that maybe I'll just use the question as an occasion to emphasize that my reading of the document is that it's calling for a multilateral, active American foreign policy and maintaining global order, but not, and reserving unilateralism for certain situations. I think implicitly does not disavow that, but the default is multilateral, particularly with allies with countries with which the United States shares values. But in the case of North Korea, China, I can't see any kind of management of the problem without Chinese involvement, and that implies lots of things about dealing with China. So I'll just leave it at that. But unilateralism in that case, I just can't see it working out. On this excellent question on reconciling the document and lots of what has been said with Scripture, which obviously does not speak directly to any of this. It's, as I say, different social world, both the Old and New Testaments, which have lots of heterogeneity within them, vastly different from the world we have, nation states, the church, mature. So really addressing the question would require engaging theologically, as you recognize in asking the question. I will say for my part, I have found, as an evangelical Protestant, found reflection by Christians over the ages, Augustine being an example, but Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, some more contemporary people, to be extremely helpful. And I respect traditions that don't want to go there, that really want to stick with the words of Scripture. But I will say one reason why I don't follow that approach is I've found that empirically it can lead to one of two things. Either a real withdrawal from politics and Anabaptism, which says none of this is in the Bible, and so we should have nothing to do with it. Or at the other end of the spectrum, an uncritical adoption of whatever the nation is doing at the time. Because Scripture doesn't speak to this, I guess we just do what. And that also, I think, is not helpful. I think the church needs to stand in judgment over the nations, including our own nation. And we need some equipment to do that is shaped by Scripture, but also informed by really centuries of reflection, of thinking about politics. So.
That's pretty good. I think it touches on as well, and you see in Thomas Aquinas, he wrestles with the same question. What is the best form of government that derives from Scripture? I think he lands on monarchy, and then he disqualifies it a bit later. We know that the individual is not the best. We know that the state is not the best. Anything in between is probably not the best either. How do you do it? There's a very good, I'm giving shout outs to allies here, there's a very good conversation going on right now in Mosaic between, I can't pronounce the names. And then Peter Berkowitz responded to it, and I commend that sequence of essays too. They're very good. Where they talk about the nation state and nationalism and how does that sync with the religiously informed view. I'd like to give the opportunity for Robert Nicholson, who I mentioned earlier is the co-publisher of Providence, and he's the director of the Fields Project up in New York City, to close our evening. And then I invite you to a reception in the back, and you can corner anybody, Timothy Mallard, Tafiq Hamid, or any of us, and one another. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I guess I'm really bad at doing up here. As somebody who's been involved in this declaration in Providence, I just wanted to say a few words about a little bit more about the thought process, and this will be short, but also about the application of this whole endeavor. How can it be useful? Because for me, in my work, I think I think it really matters, and that's how this all came about. I'm going to talk about it in the context of what I do. So my organization, the Philos Project, is all about promoting positive Christian engagement in the Middle East. And we do that by educating leaders and future leaders on the issues of the Middle East that are important, helping them to think them through so that they can engage with them in whatever professional sphere that they're in. I founded this a few years ago. And I'm thinking very much, okay, we need to educate people on these Middle Eastern issues, but it became very clear very early that there was a fundamental problem before we even got to the substantive issues of the Middle East, and that is many Christians, particularly younger Christians, don't know how to think about these issues. They don't know how to think about general American engagement abroad. They don't know how to think about the state and their faith and power and war and peace and all of these different things. And in conversations with Mark Tooley and Mark Levesque, it became clear that there needed to be something there just to get people through the door, and that was the beginning of the discussion on Providence. And the declaration was very much like, let's establish some sort of baseline of what Christian approach to foreign policy is. And the immediate response people gave was what some people here have said, and that is, why Christian? Christian really? Is there a Christian foreign policy? And I think I'm personally not ashamed to have a perspective as a Christian. I think there could be a Muslim foreign policy, there's a secular, certain liberal foreign policy, I think there's many foreign policies. This is a Christian approach to foreign policy, and I don't think anyone needs to apologize for that. Our faith is cosmic, it's holistic, and certainly it has something to say about how we engage with the world. But it was interesting, I was in one of my early discussions about this whole thing was with Walter Russell Mead, who some of you know. And Walter and I, we were having lunch, and now we're talking about this. He's like, some of the worst things in history have been done in the name of Christian foreign policy. And he said something that stuck with me, it's very important. Walter said, I'm actually much less interested in the idea of Christian foreign policy than I am in the idea that people who make and shape foreign policy are themselves formed by the Christian tradition. Really shifting the conversation that way, and it's true. We need more Christians, more young Christians in foreign policy. I think you see many young Christians doing lots of amazing things, sharp people, smart people, and most of what they go into is domestic. There's this sort of void, I find. There's no concerted Christian effort to do foreign policy. All kinds of other issues, there's concerted Christian efforts to do. And foreign policy is sort of like this, there's like a line there. You cross over and you're in some other secular realm. And I think that Christians, if you're a Christian and you believe the truth claims of Christianity, you will agree that Christians are in some way, I think, uniquely qualified to think through some of these issues, understanding human nature, understanding the nature of God as we do, and thinking about all of these things at the same time. And so Walter's right. We need more Christians who are shaped by this tradition in the space, and right now it's lagging, it's lacking, we need to do more. But getting more Christian people, I think, is not enough. There also needs to be some Christian thought to go with the Christian people who are going into this space, because otherwise we're just sending people in as Christians and saying, just sort of conform to whatever it is that you're doing, whatever administration, whatever foreign policy regime you're under, be a Christian in that space. And I just think there's a little bit more that Christianity has to say about this very important issue. And there's all kinds of obstacles. I mean, as Christians, you're thinking about, okay, foreign policy, but then there's missions, and then there's evangelism, and there's all these, how do all these things happen at the same time? I think even more interestingly, I think it's come out a lot in this recent election, there's even sort of there's an underlying confusion as Christians. There's sort of an alienation from our own society in a lot of ways. As we become more and more aware that the sort of our dual citizenship as Christians in the kingdom of God and Americans here in the kingdom of man, it's not so overlapping. There's a lot of divergence, and there's more and more divergence. And I think many Christians are starting to disbelieve in even their own country, let alone what our country is trying to do in other countries. And that kind of internal alienation is something that we have to address. And I think you see it in the Iraq War, you see it in all kinds of different things. And it's important for us that as Christian people go into this, that they're equipped with some kind of standard, some sort of baseline of Christian thought on the issue, that they can measure what they encounter up against. But for me, getting more Christian thought into the space isn't enough one time. There needs to be an ongoing conversation, an ongoing discussion, an evolution, I think, of something that's very embryonic at this point, really getting people together, young people with people like Paul and John and Mary, to really be learning and mentoring and to build a real movement. I mean, and that's part of what Providence does. Providence advances substantive arguments and new ideas, or old ideas in lots of cases. But Providence also brings together, in a relational way, people who are practicing foreign policy, people who are interested in foreign policy, young people who would like to get into foreign policy. And that aspect of Providence is actually, in my mind, even more important in a lot of ways than the substance of the actual issues. So I think as we're going into 2017, how I'm thinking about this declaration of Providence is that there needs to be a whole range of things, of convenings, of discussions, of developing young leadership that we at the Philos Project and IRD and Providence are committed to unveiling. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that as we build on this declaration and move it into the future. This one statement is not enough, and I think that there's so much more to be done. So we know, I mean, as Christians, we know, like, peace is elusive. Final peace won't come until the Prince of Peace comes back. But in the meantime, you know, we should be stewarding both of our citizenships, our earthly and our heavenly citizenship, in the service of justice, even incremental and imperfect justice. And I think that we have an obligation as Christians, and we should feel it most, especially this obligation to be engaged, to not disengage, especially in a moment when there's no choice of disengaging, that we're engaged and we're doing so thoughtfully with a foundation and not in any kind of ad hoc basis. So I'm excited about this. It's amazing to see, you know, what was really sort of an email chain come to fruition here tonight. And thank you all for coming. I hope you'll stay for the reception, and God will bless us in our efforts. Thank you.